Welcome and good evening. Welcome to what I believe to be the first lecture on our spring docket. I'm not sure if I was supposed to show up last week to a lecture or something. I apologize to that lecturer if there was one. If not, this would be a great first one. Many of you know that this year we welcomed a new faculty member, a couple actually. Peter Osler joined us after an exhaustive search, I can tell you, because I was a part of the search committee and I was exhausted at the end of it. I can also tell you that Peter comes to us having studied quite a few things and practiced a few more. I believe he has a Bachelor of Resource Management, Natural Resources, I got it right. He then went on to pursue an MLA and MArch at Harvard. I should say U of M, your undergraduate work completed at U of M. Go Buckeyes. I'm just kidding. Boy, that was... you're mad, aren't you? That's legitimate.
No.
All right, you're fine.
My wife's from Columbus.
All right, that's right. I realize we get along because of that. Peter also spent some time on the campus of Cranbrook. I think initially hired as a campus architect and then transitioned to landscape architect and planner, campus landscape architect and planner. I could think of a few better places to practice those things than Cranbrook's campus. He also went on at one point in time in his career to earn the Rome Prize, which is an incredibly prestigious appointment and something for which he should be commended and we should chat about. In terms of academic appointments, you've spent some time at IT, you've spent some time in Urbana, yes?
Champaign-Urbana.
And now you're spending time with us.
Harvard, yeah.
I should have mentioned Harvard as well. And then us, right, okay. And I couldn't be happier that Peter's here with us, not just tonight, but as a part of our faculty. I think he's added a great deal to the dialogue in this place, and I am confident that he will continue to do so. And I'm also confident that he will do so tonight. So thank you, Peter, for coming and sharing your work with us, and I look forward to hearing about it. Please, you're welcome.
Thank you, Scott. So it's a bit different than the typical lecturer. Usually you have somebody better known than me standing here who's coming into town and then leaving quickly. But since I'm a faculty member here, it's a bit of I feel like a debutante. I'm coming out, and some of you know who I am, but others don't. I've only taught one studio, 1.5 group of students, and kind of embarking on a second studio. So I thought I would begin with a bit of background, and that you'll see how it relates to some of the work I've done. This isn't a recent work lecture. It's more about a specific place that I've begun to do some research on. The research is actually quite nascent. So perhaps you can give me some ideas on how to deepen my investigation. But you'll see that there is, in fact, kind of a string that ties together how I grew up and how I ended up, in fact, being interested in this place that I have found so incredibly wonderful. So this is me. And grade 4 in Ann Arbor. And I look like a pretty typical kid, like all the other kids there. Lurking underneath the surface there, however, is something much more tortured, which is that I was a child of many generations of architects. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but this just kind of gives you a sense of, grandfather and great uncle and dad and my sister and my wife, and it's really pretty sick. So, many of you, most of you are not from a background like me, and I would especially commend you for choosing architecture. It's actually, you made a creative decision. It was a very creative decision on my part. I was brainwashed as a child, and I've told this story many times how, growing up, all our vacations were to go look at buildings, and discussions around the dinner table were always about architecture. This is some work by my father who actually recently deceased. So I grew up also on the piece of land that I grew up actually had a great deal of influence on me. This is northeast side of Ann Arbor. If you know Ann Arbor at all, this is kind of near Huron High School. That's Glacier Way going up the hill there. And this was the farm that my paternal grandfather, who was a county agricultural extension agent, a farmer, settled here and developed this land. And actually my family's been living on this land for a number of generations. And I was born, not literally in, but my first house that I lived in was the converted barn that my father and grandfather built, rehabbed. And I'm sure those of you that are of my generation or close to it would recognize some of the, accoutrement here, the George Nelson clock and the Reesum chairs and things like that. So those of you who are younger, most of you are, I'm getting to the age where people are generally younger than I am, but in any case, you might not recognize these things. This is kind of classic mid-century modern furniture and accessories, and this is kind of the world that I grew up, again, kind of immersed in. In essence, our lives were kind of, again, very much about design and at all different levels and in all aspects of life. So this is the property many years later after that first image that I showed, and these circles here begin to describe kind of the evolution of the property that I grew up on. Number one is my grandparents' house, and number two was the barn that I lived my first 5 years in, and then number three is the house that my father designed that we spent most of our lives in. And then number four was a house that then we started subdividing the property and built a house that my father designed for wonderful neighbors. And then finally, kind of the big move there on the left, on the west side, is a condominium development that my father designed and developed. So you can see that this property developed from a farm into kind of a multi-residential and structural kind of piece of property. And of course it has, if you remember that first image that just had an orchard and very few trees, you can see now that it's quite different. And this was a result, for the most part, of the work of my farmer, agricultural extension agent grandfather, and my father and his brother. And so they planted little seedlings, mostly pine trees, and thousands of them literally, and it completely transformed this property. And it's kind of interesting. A personal note is that a lot of the trees were Scotch pine, and Scotch pine actually have come down with something called the nematode. The nematode kills Scotch pine, and it's decimated this forest. And as my father was coming to the end of his life, it was kind of coincident with the kind of decline of these Scotch pine, which is really kind of poetic. And in fact, what we ended up doing is for his cremains container, taking a pine tree that died, that fell over in a windstorm, essentially at the same time that he died, and put his ashes in. So kind of comes full circle that something that my dad planted then was buried in. So this is a quote by a fellow named Alexander Gerard, who was really one of the great mid-century modernist designers. He was an architect, but he really made a name for himself in terms of pattern design, fabric design, furniture. If you've ever come across the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana, he was instrumental in that work. I'll read it here. Wherever we go and whatever we do, design is always with us, making itself felt in our lives. Physically, good design can go far to increase the efficiency of our actions. Spiritually, it can add much to our enjoyment of things around us. So it follows that in a very real sense, how much we know about design is a large measure of how much we get out of life. So again, this kind of sets the context for, again, my kind of that world that I was growing up in, but also the way that I've kind of pursued my professional life, getting many degrees and incurring lots of student debt, and having lots of different positions. So you can imagine how fantastic it was to have the opportunity to work at Cranbrook. And my experience so far in just my semester here has been that when you ask if people have been to Cranbrook, maybe a few people raise their hand and other people shake their head no, which is a real tragedy. You've got to go there, and you've got to go there many, many times. I mean, it is really one of the great places on earth, and it's not something that you can digest in one visit. It's a place that really needs to be kind of, your understanding of it needs to be nurtured over time and many visits. This is the kind of about 400-acre campus of Cranbrook, and it shows projects that I was involved with at one level or another while I was working there, both on staff and then after the Cranbrook Architecture office closed in private practice. And you can see I'm covering a lot of ground, and I'm covering many of the different institutions there, the Art Academy and the schools at different levels, the Institute of Science and so forth. So really kind of a pretty broad coverage at, again, different levels and different kinds of projects. Now, one of the great things about Cranbrook that everybody talks about is, in essence, its site planning and the kind of articulation of the buildings relative to outdoor space. And that really is one of the great things about Cranbrook. This comes from kind of a sensibility of someone who's coming from Scandinavia, Northern European, where light is at a premium. There, Saarinen designed, for good reason, thin bar buildings that allow a lot of light to penetrate into interior spaces, and the creation of a lot of figural interior court spaces. And of course, this is the work of really one of the great geniuses of any century, Eliel Saarinen, and the Saarinen family, of which Karen Swanson is a descendant of. And really one of the great things ever, anywhere. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. But it's very interesting, the relationship between these buildings and the landscape is of course, of its time. The nice thing about Cranbrook that also relates to what I'll be showing you is this kind of longue durée, this idea of an extended occupation, just like my family living on that piece of property, even more so here, a patron, an ongoing institution occupying one site, and it evolving very sensitively, I would say, and intelligently over time, which means that in fact it's not just replicating itself in terms of style, right? The idea of Saarinen being there over many, many decades, his approach to architecture was changing, and therefore his view of the world was changing, and therefore his architecture was changing. And so the work, it evolves and it gets more modern as time goes on. And the landscape actually is changing along with it. So one of the interesting things about Cranbrook, I won't go into any detail here, but is you start out with an arts and crafts kind of landscape, which has a certain kind of plant palette and a way of arranging space and a defining space, and then it gets more modern. It gets a bit more distilled, a bit more reductive, a bit more about monocultures as it evolves. This is showing some of the, again, kind of the early part of Cranbrook, the Art Academy residential buildings, and then later, then the boys' campus, one of the early parts of Cranbrook. So this was originally an arts and crafts, it's an arts and crafts architecture with originally an arts and crafts landscape along Triton Pools. But when the peristyle is built and the museum and the library are built a number of decades later, you can see it's a different architecture. It's more distilled. It's kind of a Nordic classicist influence kind of work. And the landscape, actually, they came in and they, in essence, subtracted from the existing landscape to make it simpler and kind of stronger visually. And so the work that I was involved with, the most significant project that I worked on was the site design for Williams Natatorium, and it's quite a large site. You can see here, here's the old entrance to Cranbrook Academy Way. We created a new entrance to the campus, to the boys, what's called the boys' campus here, and in essence looked at this entire vista that links the building to Academy Way. So this is a view taken from this little point noted here. And the important thing to note here is just kind of a very, very simple move, is that when you look at this, how this landscape in the foreground is connecting with this landscape in the background, there's actually that big turnaround that's in between, right? Lots of paving, and you can't see that because of the way that we treated that elevation of grade. And it also came down to, again, just kind of trying to be as best we could sensitive to the history of Cranbrook, but not feeling beholden to a particular style. In fact, thinking of how we could advance, just like Saarinen was advancing his aesthetic through the years, trying to do the same thing ourselves, trying to be kind of honest to the time. So, you know, looking at weavings of Loya Saarinen, but not literally trying to make them look like weavings, but kind of abstracting it in terms of even simple things like paving patterns, where you have a weft and a waft, and where they come together, there's kind of a marking of that intersection. One of the things that happened at Cranbrook, which was both really enlightening and also quite painful, was the relationship that I had with the grounds superintendent there. And he had very, very distinct ideas about how the landscape should be maintained, and I had ideas that I thought were, well, better. And actually they came from, I thought, a more robust understanding of Cranbrook's history, and he was thinking about it more in terms of just kind of function, the ease of maintenance, the cost of things, the fit of turning radii to lawnmowers and things like that, which was a really interesting battle that we had. And out of that battle came, in essence, my Rome Prize application, or my proposal for a study in Rome. So I tell this story only because out of bad experiences can come really good things. You just have to kind of try to sometimes step back and try to understand what's going on. So I became very interested in kind of the poetics of maintenance, as I was calling it, kind of thinking about how landscapes change and how they're maintained over time, and how projects can be made to animate those kinds of functions and operations in poetic ways. And so this was a photograph that I took of a large photographic series of the maintenance of gardens in Rome, and then there was this piece that I termed a kind of constructed research that came out of that, and it's been difficult to manifest real legible aspects of that or things that push that idea in my own work. I continue to try to manifest it, but it's tough. So on to really the bulk of what I want to talk about tonight, which is this amazing place, a foundation in kind of west central Germany called Insel Hombroek. And wow, God, that looks very strange. That looks like just, it looks like Germany when I look at it here. So if you know, like the Netherlands is up here, and Belgium's down here, right? The Czech Republic is over there. Denmark, you can see, is up there. And right in here is Dusseldorf. Dusseldorf and Cologne. And you can see Essen and Duisburg, which are kind of, that's the heart of the Ruhrgebiet, which is the industrial area of Germany, where they made all the steel and continue to make steel up there. Insel Hombroek is just about 15 minutes out of Dusseldorf. It's actually out in farm country. It's a bit of a pilgrimage to get there, which is actually, I would say, in some ways, kind of the first thing that you maybe aren't so conscious of, but in fact, I think does kind of change the way you perceive the place. So you're kind of getting out of the city, you're kind of going into the country, into the hinterlands to see this thing. You have to have a purpose, so you have to make the decision to go there. You don't typically stumble across it. Actually, in total, the land holdings of Insel Holmbroek are about the same as Cranbrook, about 400 acres. The parts that are developed currently are this valley down here. So this is up high. This road is kind of coming along not a ridge. There's a ridge right along in here, but this is kind of the beginning of a pitch down to the River Elft, which is a tributary of the Rhine River, and all of this belongs to Insel Holmbroek. And then a part that I'm not going to be spending much time at all talking about is this thing called the Raketa Station, the rocket station, which is an old NATO missile site. And this is also really amazing. But this is kind of made up of, there are a fair number of star architect buildings up here. So I'm going to be maybe the one person who lectures here in your career that doesn't talk about star architects. There's a Tadao Ando building here. There's a Raymond Abraham building, who's a really interesting architect who died recently, unfortunately. There's an Alvaro Siza building here. The rest of the buildings are done by the same person who designed most of the buildings down in this valley here, which is quite interesting because he wasn't an architect, he's actually a sculptor. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, we were talking about transdisciplinary design and thinking in studio today with Constance, and maybe this is a good example of transdisciplinary design. A sculptor designing the buildings, a biologist essentially designing the landscape, and then a lot of artists in their work. But Insel Holmbroek is kind of an interesting thing. It's kind of, again, it's this evolving long-term history. In the late 19th century, there was a family that bought property here. They built a small house. This is the Insel Holmbroek kind of area in here along the River Elft. This is just agricultural fields up here. Drawings over time. The property went through a lot of changes over time. This landscape is kind of one might call it a picturesque kind of landscape. A lot of exotic horticulture on this site. Very gardeny, the way you might think of gardens being traditionally. Quite a bit of earth moving. You can see here this channel in here was actually constructed. You can see here the drawing that shows all these sections of how they actually created that little route of kind of another tributary for the property to actually make it an island or an Insel. Insel in German means island. So this is the family in its early days of the property, kind of a formal garden that was built. And as this property evolved and a fellow named Carl Mueller bought it, he bought it with the intention he wanted to display his actually fairly large private art collection. He wanted to provide a venue where people could view that art. And I don't know if you guys read the New York Times in the business section a couple of weeks ago. Last week there was a big article about people who in fact are doing this a lot now. They're wealthy people, this man was quite wealthy, are building their own museums essentially and developing their grounds to display art. And it was in the business section because there are all kinds of tax implications of doing that. So I don't think that for this fellow, taxes was really the motivating factor. Everything would indicate that in fact he had this really deep, passionate, a bit like George Booth, this kind of driving force. George Booth was the patron of Cranbrook, to create, in essence, almost his own world, kind of create almost a utopia. And I'm just realizing that I didn't mention that there's another huge part of this property that is, I think it came earlier, that is proposed for development, and that actually has a lot of star architects on its roster, which I'm a bit worried about. But it'll be kind of separate, somewhat separate from this initial part, so I think that's actually quite good, that this initial part will be somewhat insulated and isolated from everybody shouting and screaming. So the gardens are approached, these formal gardens. It's evolved, it's grown, it's been neglected through the years, and the people who are kind of the stewards of this property, and it is a landscape architect who's been on this property for 18 years, who has really been the main person in terms of being the steward for the evolution of this property. Not only the land and the landscape, but the buildings, the upkeep of the buildings. Another transdisciplinary kind of thinker. Many ways, what I want to emphasize here is that there's an approach to the landscape here which allows for change. It's not about trying to enforce a fixed idea about the landscape, and this is something that's, again, something that I think is quite interesting to think about relative to the kind of landscapes that we see around us. How fixed are they? How do they evolve over time? Just an image from, I think this is from the 30s, and then a contemporary picture, so you can see this tree here is this tree here. So there is actually quite a bit of existing fabric, if you want to call it that, not only in terms of the house and some of the grading, the topography, but also, in fact, some of the horticulture. And they in fact have been very, very rigorous about documenting all of that. So here's the way that the property is kind of developing, or how it has developed over time, going from the oldest being the light to the darkest blue being the more recent. So, down here is the early part, and that's the part that I'm going to be really focusing on in the upcoming images. The rest of this property has been acquired over time. This is the Raquetta station, as I described earlier. That other part that I was talking about actually takes up all of this land as well as a bunch of land over here. So it's really going to, in the end, eventually perhaps, be almost, again, like a utopian city. That's the idea of the designers who are taking on these future land holdings. That's an idea of live-work communities that are completely sustainable. It's quite interesting. What it looks like from the air, from an aerial photograph, again, the valley that I'm going to be talking about, the Raquetta station, and they've started to string together this link here. There's a road and there's a project here done by another sculptor from, I think he's Danish, named Per Herkeby, and he is, actually he's a painter, not a sculptor, and so he's designed the buildings here, and they're amazing too. I'm not going to show those. Here's the development that I talked about earlier that I thought that I had missed. So here's the valley. The Raquetta station is here, and look at all of this. This is all new, like all of that, all of this. So pretty amazing, interesting to think about this. You can go there yourself in the future and see the new work. This is a aerial of the Raquetta station, again, the Raymond Abraham building, which is a music building. It's called a house for the musician. It's a performance as well as a residential space. This is the Ondo Museum. This is the Alvaro Siza building, a museum as well. This is, in essence, a little dorm that you can stay in, which is quite lovely. And then housing for some of the people who live here. So there's actually as I said before, it's a very interesting, it's a place that's been made out of very close relationships between the patron and these artists who he found and found close association with, kind of developed strong relations with them, and he in essence created a place where all these people could live. So there's an opera singer, and there's a composer, and there's a poet, and the poet is drunk all the time. You see him stumbling around. It's kind of sad. And then there's a sculptor whose studio is here and has this as his yard. It's pretty amazing, a Japanese fellow. So there's a lot of, it's kind of a little community there of people that are actually living there. There's an architect's office. This is looking at the sculptor's studio. This is one of the buildings that used to house the missiles. So there were 3 missiles in each of these hangars that are still there. This is a mock-up of an idea for a building that he's designed. All right, so you have to think about this as a constructed landscape. When you see these images, you'll maybe think of them as being natural. That's a pretty charged word, I hope you know, and very rarely is something really natural. The only thing that's natural about most landscapes is that they've been affected by the hand of humans, right? They've been constructed in one way or another, especially these days in the Anthropocene, where we have limitless kind of influence. So this is what the landscape to the west of the valley looks like. This is the watchtower for the Requeta station that you can barely see there. This is the land in the valley being constructed where they're restoring some wetlands in here, and they actually did a lot of borings and did very, very rigorous analyses of these borings and found very distinct kind of stratigraphy in terms of the levels of development of land. They analyzed pollen to find the species that were there, and so they're operating from a really, really strong kind of scientific understanding of the site. And this is what the valley looks like now. So from this essentially to this, and this is one of the pavilions. So the site plan of this, if you think about it as a museum, a place where one goes to see art, it's a quite interesting approach, and it's really one of the first approaches. I mean, one could think of the Venice Biennale grounds or the Louisiana Museum, if you know that building in Denmark, which kind of weaves through the landscape. But separating one person's collection across a piece of property with individual buildings, they're kind of seen and called, I think, referred to it as, in essence, chapels of art in the landscape. They are essentially what you're seeing as these black figures. So I'll just take you through the landscape a bit, and what's important to think about, and there's a whole lot of scholarly work on the reception of art, and the person who's in a museum looking at art. It used to be about just the museums and the art itself. The viewer wasn't so much an issue. Now, in fact, that's the weighting of interest and emphasis has actually changed quite a bit. So this is very much kind of tied into that. I'm not a scholar in that area, but it definitely really affects, and I hope I can insert a bit of sensibility of what I have kind of grown to appreciate at this place through the 4 times that I've been there, is how much a difference that makes, and how that really does create this very charged relationship between not just the architecture and the landscape, but the architecture and the art and the landscape. So and the landscape and the architecture. So everything is kind of working in concert in a very, very interesting way. It's very, I know I won't be completely successful. I think it's one of these things that you have to go to for sure to fully understand. I can't do it in the limited time I have, but I'll do my best. So one comes off the main road, which is up here, and you park here in this very understated, unpaved parking lot. It's a bit kind of messy and not crude, but it kind of, in some ways, almost kind of barely organized. This is the entrance building. You pay an entrance fee. I think it's 15 euros or something. So it's not cheap, but you can spend the entire day here. It essentially closes at dusk. And another thing that's really amazing about this is that all the little things that fall into place that make this an unusual experience. I mentioned the kind of location of the buildings away from one another. Another thing is that in fact you can just wander all day, and you can go in and spend your entire day in one building in front of one piece. No one's going to tell you to go. You know, this has been compared to Marfa. You may have heard of Marfa in Texas. At Marfa, you have to take a tour, and there's a tour guide, and although the tours are kind of slow, you can't stay there. You have to, you're a head of cattle, and you have to kind of you're ushered around. And here, there's no security in these buildings. There's nobody saying, don't touch that. There's no one saying, don't take photographs. There's no didactic labeling of the work with any explanation. There's no big sign saying this is such and such an artist and what his or her work's about. It's all super personal in that regard. The buildings don't have any artificial light in them, so that's why it closes at dusk, because the buildings get dark. And so sometimes if it's a cloudy day, the buildings are, a little bit dark. If it's bright, the work's brighter. It's really fantastic. Really fantastic. Also wanted to mention one of the other things that's pretty neat about this site plan is that note how the pavilions are kind of around the outside of the property. Okay, boom, 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 up here, right? The heart of the property here with all these wetlands, a lot of that is land that you don't go into. There aren't paths that go in there. You're essentially not allowed. I've never seen it. They just have these little strings, kind of primitive little boundaries. There aren't any signs or anything. But I've never seen anybody in the 4 times that I've been there violating that. Again, there aren't police going around and tell you to stay off of things. It seems to be something that's understood. But in any case, so the idea of leaving the center of the site open, right? Not putting the building in the center of the site, putting the buildings around the outside and creating a space, in essence, where people don't go. I mean, how does that affect the meaning of a place? Well, one thing it does is it certainly allows you these very long views across the site through an uninhabited and uninhibited space, in essence. All right, so you're always looking kind of across the landscape, not looking through people or through a building. This is so washed out. It's really crazy. Terrible. Maybe everybody should come down and look at my screen here. It looks really good here. So if you can see this at all, you can start to see the character of the architecture. Super, super simple, kind of primal forms of buildings. Very, very simple. Based on strict geometry, based on a 1 meter by 1 meter grid. And the landscape, God, this is so depressing. What you should be able to see is actually there's they've actually taken the landscape and developed different kind of precincts, large precincts, which in fact are based on the history of the site. So this kind of area downtown in here is where the old house. This is the old house that you saw in that old photograph, and so this property has kind of a distinct character in terms of its topography and the horticulture there. And then there's the meadow, the kind of low wetland meadow in here. There's another meadow up here that's up on a hill. Okay, so that's another area. There are 4 distinct areas, and then this over here is kind of the wooded area, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So there is a sensibility in terms of the landscape, how each one has a very, very subtle difference in terms of its plant material. at least it's some, in terms of the herbaceous, which is the non-woody stuff, not the trees and the shrubs, but you might think of them as flowers, and the grasses. This is the open meadow and the wetland in the center of the site, and that's the first pavilion, which I'll show in a bit. There is also a pretty interesting level of maintenance that is a very traditional part of European landscape maintenance, this idea of it's called pollarding, where you cut the branches way, way back. This is done for all kinds of reasons, produce firewood, make fences, all kinds of things. In this case, a lot of it has to do with views, in essence, to keep certain views open. But then in other cases, they don't pollard them every year. They may only pollard them every other year or something like that. So the level of maintenance on this landscape is super subtle, and for the most part, I guess you wouldn't call that subtle. But again, if you're in Europe, this is pretty standard. I mean, you see this all over European streets, city streets, and in gardens. But so for Americans, it may seem violent and mean to the plants, but one thing that you can begin to see, this is coming down. I think I've got a picture a little bit later of the view from the entrance, but once you pay your ticket, your admission. I should also mention that you buy your ticket and then there's a canteen on the site, and they have organic food, most of which comes from the property, and you could sit in the cafe and eat all day if you wanted. It's all free. The coffee's free. It's kind of nice. So anytime you want to take a break, you can go to the canteen and hang out. Anyways, what you can see here is barely you can start to see one of the pavilions, the first pavilion, behind these trees. So there's definitely, and this is kind of pretty standard landscape design practice, is to use vegetation to choreograph one's experience of the landscape, right? So trees in front of something that they're hiding, and then you come around a corner and it reveals itself. Maybe sometimes you see it from a long distance, but then you go a little bit farther in the middle ground, the trees keep it from you, and then you come around a corner again, you see it close up. So you see it from far away and close up, but not in the middle ground. That kind of choreography of the landscape and the choreography of these pavilions is really fantastic as you go through this landscape. I'm not going to kind of take you through a full circuit, but it's pretty amazing the way that it's done. I mentioned kind of the individual zones, the precincts, and kind of how they have kind of subtly legibly different landscapes, oftentimes in the herbaceous material. So this is up on the hill. There's a very, very famous landscape architect named Piet Oudolf, who was a Dutch, really one of the great plant designers in the world. He did the High Line, by the way, if you know that. And Piet kind of consults on this property with that landscape architect that I mentioned. So this is yet another. You can see the difference here. This is in a different part of the site. This is actually up by the Raqueta station. There's a little kind of cloister garden in the background there. Woodlands are different. You can see these lupins here. Again, in the middle, wetland area, the meadows. You can also, one of the great things about, and this is really true of the European landscape, is that it's not so uncommon to see these very, very different and legible types of landscape, if you know anything about them, that indicate different types of land use. So, this is, more or less kind of a very passive landscape, but you see these big poplars in the background. Those are windbreaks for agricultural fields that are in the background, so or beyond. So, anyway, so you're always getting this very interesting heterogeneous kind of view as you look across the landscape at Insel Hombroek. I mentioned that there's food that they serve at the canteen. It's actually a working landscape, so there are some orchards. Courtyards. This is a plant called allium. It's in the onion family. An oak that's in the courtyard. This is the that little kind of dorm that I mentioned earlier. It's in the courtyard of that dorm. And so those are kind of surfaces. And actually, if you think about the color and texture of those meadows, I want you to kind of try to keep those in your mind, because later on we'll be looking at some of the art that's inside the buildings. And I think you'll see, not a mimicking at all, but I think you'll see kind of an affinity of sensibility about some of the art and some of the approaches to the landscape. So I have never read this, but and I haven't heard it discussed this way, but I think that those meadows are a bit like canvases. They're a bit like canvases that can be painted upon. So there's a certain affinity there between the art and the landscape, for sure. Again, sometimes a somewhat passive approach to the landscape. Here's a tree that's getting overtaken by ivy. You know, a lot of people would think that was bad for the tree, and they'd take that out. They let it happen. They let it happen. I mean, it's kind of cool, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of a furry tree. In essence, it's talking about a certain ecology, the way seeds move around either by wind or by animals. And so they allow that to happen, and they're fairly delicate in that regard. The other thing, however, though, is that they're amazing with their pruning. They selectively take things, they're always kind of subtracting from the landscape in very subtle ways. So for instance, to create shafts of light coming down on certain places where there would be a sculpture or a bench to sit on, that's not, I mean, it might just happen itself, but this in fact is a place where they did do that over time through maintenance. So in my title, when I said glancing branches, what I meant by that is that there are lots of places in this landscape. I think when you're in the American landscape, there are all these issues of liability and kind of clarity and so forth. So things are kept at bay, right? The landscape's kind of kept at bay. Here, in fact, you're kind of doing this as you move through the landscape. You're kind of pushing things aside sometimes, which really is a fantastic thing. I mean, it lends this kind of amazing intimacy. You touch the landscape, you feel it, and it's kind of a dance back and forth. Very purposeful, very purposeful. There are some monoculture forests and groves of trees that are on grids, so it's not as though the whole thing is kind of looking natural. There are these, I mentioned orchards before. There are these moments where you come to the landscape and there are in fact these very, very legible interventions, right? So again, there's a range of legibility in the landscape, not only with color, but also in terms of the way things are planted. All right, this fantastic quote by Stephen Jay Gould, there's no science without fancy and there can be no art without facts. So again, I think this is very true at Insel Holmbreuk. You think of it as a venue for art, but on the other hand, they act because they act responsibly because they know the site really, really well. I mentioned those borings that they've taken and studied in labs and studied very carefully, and they know the site, they know its history going back like 10,000 years, all right? So they're making decisions based on that long history, kind of almost deep time kind of understanding of the site. These are just, it's not important to say what they are, but just to give you a sense of how the landscape is mapped from different types of maintenance to invasive species to shrubs here, and then here, shrubs and trees, and then here is the water system, which is quite interesting. The water isn't just naturally coursing through there. There are a number of pumps that lift the water up from the river Eft and get it into the site so that it can move through the landscape. It moves very, very slowly, but if you stop and watch it, you can actually see it moving. So we think of landscape maintenance typically, again, as this very, very dry thing. And again, I mentioned before my interest in in the artistry of that, the process and those operations. So this is a graph, and I know you can't, I can read it perfectly here. But this is kind of the objectification and the quantification of how that landscape is operating. People on certain places, in certain places at certain times during certain times of the year, very, very specific in terms of where they are, but they're looking very carefully at the site before they act. There's also this fantastic kind of, I've mentioned a number of times, kind of looseness to the landscape, and so in a very provocative sense of what can be done with accidents and what can be done with just the natural change that happens in a landscape. So here's a set of diagrams of the idea that you start out with a grove of trees. Over time, the trees start to die. They get old and they die. And there's a path that's going through here. So what do? You start to cut trees like shown here, right? You don't take the trees away. You might think of fallen trees as being ugly or something, or how sad that a tree's fallen. Let's take away this sadness. In fact, here it's something that they try to make very legible. So over time, what you can see is that the landscape, not only of these, that's the kind of environment that these fallen trees are creating, and I'll show some images of that, is evolving along with a landscape that's going, starting out here as a grove of a monoculture of trees, but then starting to break apart and other species starting to invade it, right? So it ends up being a much more heterogeneous landscape over time. But you can still see the remnants of that order. All right, so trees fall, the light comes in, ferns start coming up, lichen starts to grow, right? Fungus starts to grow on the trees. Animals start using the trees as habitat. So there's this idea of, certainly, there's a visual aspect to this. There's kind of an olfactory aspect to it. You smell it. But there's also, of course, a really robust sustainability agenda here where they're trying to enrich the environment as it grows. Up at the Raqueta station, it's also true. Again, ivy growing and not being tended, just allowing things to happen here. Very beautiful juxtaposition of that concrete NATO missile site infrastructure, concrete infrastructure, bunker-like, and then being kind of gradually taken over by landscape. A recent endeavor that they have is on this piece of land that's across the River Elft, and it's kind of interesting. They took this land and they got some cattle, and this is kind of I think a very native species of cattle or something to this part of Europe, and they put a family of these cattle in here, and in essence, this is described as being just an experiment. I mean, just a way to see how the animals themselves would maintain the landscape. It seems maybe a bit odd, but pretty interesting. Now, this cattle-maintained landscape is right across the river from what is the most formal part of this landscape, which is that old historic garden. Right, so you have these two juxtaposed, animals doing their own thing on one side of the river and kind of the hand of man on the other side from the 19th century. And then the last thing I would point out here is that this last summer when I was there on my most recent visit, there had been this really devastating windstorm. And the landscape architect said, it's just another opportunity. It's just, again, there would be panic in the United States when things like this happen typically. And he just saw it as another opportunity. He didn't know what he was going to do at the time. It was too recent, but in essence, making the site safe for the inhabitants of the site. But then, like I showed before, they think about these events very creatively. I mentioned sustainability and the kind of robust sustainability. They make their own carrot juice. They make their own cider from apples on the site. They make preserves, and they have, this is the canteen. This is not what it looks like every day. But they do have these amazing offerings of food that are from the site. Okay, in the architecture, and I know I've we're at an hour, so I'm going to wrap up as quickly as I can. I mentioned that the designer of the building was a sculptor, this fellow named Aaron Herrick, and the patron of this project was at Documenta, which is one of the major art shows each year, and saw this fellow's work and thought, this guy could design buildings for me. So literally, that's how it happened. He saw his work, and this is his sculpture work. These pieces are fairly small. They're made out of brass. You can see, again, the geometry. It's a cube, in essence. It kind of fits together like a puzzle. These are images of the pavilions in axonometric and plan form. Again, you can start to see the control and the simplicity of these buildings. There's one exception. I'll talk about that in a bit. The construction of these buildings is fairly, in some ways, very primitive. Through-wall brick with, a facing brick here and clay masonry behind it. These pavers, these are actually pavers from Dutch streets that they use for the cladding of the building, and they have these gigantic joints. So it really is when you walk up to these buildings, there's a real presence to that facade. You can see the construction, concrete frame with these beams with glulam on top, and then the glass skylights. Very, very precise. Everything's done to a very, very precise module, so you can see the relationships here of structure and flooring here. The way that the buildings sit in relation to the adjacent landscape differs. So one of the first pavilions that you come to, it's surrounded by this clipped hedge that's very, very close. It creates this very narrow corridor. Whereas others, like this one, they look as though they've just been slipped into the forest, all right? So there are a whole series of different, it's kind of similar in some ways, the way this architecture works. Most the buildings are made they're clad in this same brick. They're on that same module for the most part, but there's slight differences, and it's this kind of sameness but difference in the work that I think where a lot of the power of this place comes from. All right, so I mentioned what one sees when you come in. This is on high ground. You've bought your ticket. It's too bad this is washed out, but there are, in fact, a couple nuclear cooling towers in the distance. One could almost think of them as being like Thoreau's Iron Horse, from Walden Pond, hearing the train, like, civilization, whatever. I think it seems to me that if they didn't like those cooling towers, they could have found a way to orchestrate the entrance into this place so that you didn't see them. So it seems to me that there's like an intentional revealing of that view. And then you go down into the valley and then you're more immersed in the landscape and you don't see those cooling towers again. So I think that's pretty fantastic. But from here, you don't really see, if you look super carefully, you can start to see some of the pavilions through the landscape. But for the most part, you just see the landscape. You see the opening in the center. You see that water course going through. So you see that as kind of a destination. You see light going down through there. It's very much, that's a kind of a classic move of landscape architects. Leaving that center open to have light coming down through it. Olmsted did it. The Prairie School landscape architects in the Midwest did it. Jensen and Simons and others, who I'm sure you don't know about. But in any case, that's a kind of a typology or kind of a classic thing to do in the landscape. Okay, this is the first pavilion that you come to. All the other pavilions have art in them, but I think it's quite interesting that the first one you come to is completely empty. There are four. It's the smallest of the pavilions. Well, it's not. It's the second smallest of the pavilions. It has 4 doors. You see 2 of them there. The only thing, you have these 2 doors, light coming through the top, and just white walls. So you come into this building, and in essence, the doors act as frames to the landscape. Maybe the idea is that, in essence, landscape in this case is the art, right? It's kind of setting, I think, that idea, that relationship in motion from the very first pavilion that you go into. One of the other pavilions, super thin. This is, I think, 4 meters in width. Super thin. Door here, door there. You can see it's almost like going through a closet or something. Long and thin. The doors are just open. It's, you know, on cold days they're closed. On warm days they're open. Sometimes they're open, sometimes they're closed. It's just, and the doors are super heavy. Super heavy, and when they close, it goes, and it's again fantastic. The kind of the essence and the weight of this architecture. It's like super primal as an experience, I think. All right, the one that kind of shifts away from that square geometry is this one pavilion, which is actually at the end of that formal garden, which is also kind of interesting to think of. You know, instead of maybe contrasting the garden with an orthogonal piece of architecture, you do something that's made up of 2 intersecting circles. I'll leave that for you to ponder why that decision would be made. This is the last pavilion I'm going to show. Very interesting. You can't even see it. Well, anyways, this is unlike the others that are more labyrinthian, and they're literally like grids that you can kind of go through, and it's a bit like a maze, I should say. This you actually enter, and it's a one-way circulation. You get to the end, and then you have to go back out again. I included this just because I really wanted to make a point to the students. Like, if you did a building with elevations like that, how do you think your studio critic would react? They'd probably think, you can't be an architect. You have no imagination. Like, you know, don't you have more creativity than that? But so I show this because I think it's a very beautiful piece of architecture, super essential, again, kind of primal, and it's just a rectangle, right? It has a very interesting, you can't see it here, but it does have, it's like a square that's got an angle to it. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Different than the others. All of them are slightly different. All right, so finally the art. I mentioned murky sketches. So there's, I think, a sensibility about the patron of this place and his affinity for certain kinds of art, which then I think carries over to the landscape, this kind of loose and flowing landscape that has, you know, kind of subtle moments of legibility, and then kind of, you know, gets really quiet and then has slightly larger moments of volume. And a lot of the art, not all of the art, but there is a fair amount of art in this collection that has that kind of quality. These are Cézanne sketches, which are a lot nicer than what you can see, but maybe that they're washed out maybe drives my point home even further. They're kind of barely discernible, right? Maybe this is all the Cézanne he could afford. But okay, it's very subtle. It's like you have to fill in the images with your mind, with your imagination. And that's, I think, the same way that the landscape and the architecture work. These sculptures, again, kind of, I mean, look at the kind of murky quality of these sculptures. You know, loose, bit kind of crude. Rembrandt's, you know, look at these dark areas of these drawings, super dark. This is in the kind of darkest place in any of the buildings. So when you go around into this pavilion, you get to the end, and it's pretty dark in that at the end of that building, and that's where these Rembrandts are. So I'm sure it has to do with, in essence, light levels and protecting the piece, but it actually, again, it really adds to the to your relationship with it kind of intensifies the relationship. You have to get close to it and look at it carefully and close up. Gustav Klimt, you can't see those at all. These are really light, God, they're fantastic drawings. Beautiful pencil sketches, but again, not complete, let's say, not complete. Corinth paintings, again, kind of gestural and quick, one might say. And the last image that I have of the paintings, this is a contemporary painter who actually lives on the property, Grobner. And I wanted to close with this because, again, if you think about those meadows and the colors of the meadows, these aren't mimicking the colors of the meadow. They're not like named after the meadows at all. But I do think, I'm convinced that if you look at this work, and even so more some of the other work, which isn't so bright, these are, I think, named after there's some reference to fire in these pieces. I'm sorry I don't have the titles of the paintings, but he has others that are kind of murky. They look like what a stagnant pool would look like, you know, kind of brownish green, kind of murky kind of paintings. And these are actually very soft. These are, you can begin to see they're about this thick. They're like pillows, kind of. So they're stuffed somehow. I don't know how he does it, but they're kind of stuffed. And again, so there's this kind of softness to these paintings, which I think, again, has an affinity to the landscape there. So that's the end. This is the exiting of the building where I started, the first image. And so I'm hoping you got a feel for this landscape. I think that the things that I'd like you to take with you, a few things, this idea of, I think, essence, the validity of the pursuit of kind of essence in architecture. You know, in the collection, in all cases in this property, the collection, there's no video art, there's no Jeff Koons, there's no kind of big flashy stuff. It's all, maybe, you know, there are other parts of this property where they do have that kind of work. But in this part of the property, everything's kind of toned down and everything's quiet and I think very, very powerful. The landscape's that way, the architecture's that way, and the art is that way. So I would hope that you would kind of think of essences. I would hope that you would also think about the power of systems and orders, but variations in the systems, subtle variations in systems and orders. So, you know, again, all these buildings are done on a square meter grid. They have the same kind of materials and so forth. They have generally the same. They're working with the same kind of platonic geometries. But they're all they're slightly different. The window systems sometimes are different. Sometimes the doors are metal. Sometimes they're wood. Just things you hardly notice. Unless you're really awake. And I think that the great thing about, I know that in my visits to this place, the 4 times I've been here, I feel so alive when I'm here. It's like the place kind of asks a certain amount of you. You have to kind of be awake to notice things, but it rewards you. And I would say the same thing again about Cranbrook. Cranbrook is the same way. You go to Cranbrook, every time you go, you see something different. You see something new. And so if you can't afford to buy a ticket to Dusseldorf, go over to Cranbrook and look at Cranbrook very carefully. So that's it. Thank you very much. Hour and 13 minutes. I don't know if...
I think there's time for a couple questions, or
Yeah.
just a few of the burning questions, and then we can be off to whatever it is you each do when you're not in this room. So who has the first burning question? Anyone? Have some very smart colleagues and some smart-looking students in here, I'm sure.
Students should ask the first questions. Sorry, Yana.
No, you just cut off one of my smart faculty. Now we're dependent on a smart student.
I don't want to avoid the faculty questions because they'll be tough.
No, exactly.
But,
that was going to be particularly loaded, I could tell.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Let's make that second.
Yeah.
And these softball questions. Something about his shoes, perhaps. They're lovely.
Actually, I have
quite
campers
fantastic.
on. Those are pretty nice.
Well, Steve's going to have a softball question here.
So you addressed a number of the senses. What about sound? I don't think you talked about sound at all.
Yeah. Well, I would. There's. So there's no. I mentioned there's no video art. There's no film. So in terms of the art, there's no sound coming from the art. But the buildings themselves are very hard. You know, the floors and everything, so it's pretty resonant, so the spaces are fairly brittle. So there's a fair amount of reverberation in the buildings that's created by just people shuffling around and whispering and things. Out on the site, there actually are some interesting moments. There are some like little small fountains, but they're not like at Cranbrook. They're not fountains with, you know, like this. There it would be like something that's tipped and water's just pouring out of something, and but it's enough. And sometimes those are just around the corner and outside the pavilion. So I can think of one specific place where you approach the door to leave this pavilion, and you can hear the sound of gurgling water, but you can't see where it's coming from, and you can't see it until you get to, you know, all the way around to come back and see it. So, and then of course there's actually, it's a fantastic bird environment just because of the robustness of the landscape. So there are a lot of birders there, and there's a fantastic, you know, array of bird species. So there's that. Am I forgetting something? There's the paths are gravel. So when you walk, there's kind of that soft crushing sound of your feet on the gravel, which is quite lovely. Were you thinking of something else?
I'd like the image of as you leave the building, there's something to anticipate.
I would also say that there's an interesting quality to the place. The place it's got a lot of gravitas, right? It's like, and so people aren't in there making a lot of noise. I mean, it's a very reflective kind of place. Like people that are walking on the paths, they're kind of, you know, they're walking like this, and they're maybe having subtle conversations. It's not a boisterous place in any way. I think there's definitely a kind of an aura to the place that creates that kind of respect and kind of dignity. Yeah.
I'm going to ask another question. So the first pavilion that you showed that said was empty, which is filled with either landscape or light, is that, and the four doors, is that positioned in any kind of axial direction?
You know, one of the things that I'd like to do, I haven't done, is like any kind of analysis drawings of the place and kind of see if there are any of these relationships that aren't readily apparent. There is a drawing that I don't know if Raymond Abraham did it, but it takes into account that music building, and it is like, you know, crazy geometry with lots of radii and axes and things, and showing decisions that might be made in the future. But I think that's more of a speculative thing about what might happen in the future, not so much about, and it's at the Raquetta station, not down in the valley. So I haven't seen any it's a very good point in the sense that there are no design drawings or no mappings that show axes or even vistas. Like at Cranbrook, we did, one of the early things I did there was a mapping of the vistas at Cranbrook. You know, everything from really short little ones, you know, through gateways and things, like through the Friendship Arch and stuff, and then, you know, from Kingswood Lake looking up to the pylon at the Institute of Science. I mean, you know, so some really long, some really short. The landscape at Inselholmberg is much more fluid. Yeah, it's not tied together like that.
I have a student question. Can I ask a student question? I'll be honorary student for like 5 seconds, all right? If I was a student, I'd be sitting here saying, okay, you've mentioned a number of things about slowness, right? A slow pace, the decades-old march towards what Cranbrook is today, and that'll continue for quite some time. And the pace here, the appreciation of a crunching of a stone under a foot, right? Those are slow things. You also mentioned that these elevations, they're beautiful, and said offhanded that, you know, I as a student would be shot if I produced such elevations, and probably, you know, summarily drubbed right out of school, right? Because there's not enough action. And while you were saying these things, as a student, I received no fewer than 10 texts from 5 different people, and 3 notifications about my Facebook, and a couple more about Twitter, and asking me different things, right? And then I look around, and half my colleagues had to leave before we could even have a proper conversation about this lecture, right? And so I guess I would ask, as me as a student, how can I cultivate this slowness and this immersion when it seems that everything around me is conspiring against that? Wow, you can hear a pin drop now. I'm sorry. I'll go be chair again. Someone else be a
I think there are a couple things there. I would answer that maybe two ways. One is that some people really thrive in that kind of environment, and I'm not that kind of person. I'm going to someday probably drop dead of a heart attack because of just the stress that's built up through the years. But I think some people really thrive in that kind of a life. So I'm willing to go with that. I do see. I have a bias towards slowness, gosh, part of it is just discipline. The discipline of courage, or it's too strong a word, to turn off your phone or whatever. Literally just to turn off your phone. When I turned off my phone for this lecture, I knew, completely irrational, that I should turn off my phone, right? But it's still, there was a little something inside me that said, I'm turning off my phone. What happens if something happens? So I think that's so embedded in all of us, and I think that it would be really fantastic. I think you would make yourself unique in the world if among your generation, if you could actually cultivate slowness in your life, for sure. You can only, it's been like driving on a road. If you're driving at 90 miles per hour, the road has to be straighter, and it can't have as much topography to it, right? Things have to flatten out. And I would say that a life at high speed is a kind of a flattened out life in certain ways. Whereas a life that's slower, maybe that's too hokey of an analogy, but I think it's like when you're on a footpath, the footpath can do all kinds of things, right? And you notice things because you're moving at slower things. Does that answer the?
It does indeed. Thank you. Thank you again for lecturing. Oh, you have another, Claire?
I was just going to say, perhaps go back to your transdisciplinary comment at the beginning, that slowness is something we might be able to learn as architects from landscape.
Yeah.
Because when you plant something, you're looking 10, 20, 50 years down the road. It's not instant gratification.
Yeah. I was trained when I went to school. I was trained by a very notable landscape architect named Pete Walker, who was all about legibility. And when we were in school, everything was about landscape as object, and making things, because it was, in some ways, it was about architects get to do things that everybody notices, right? And landscape architects are doing soft things all the time, and it's like nobody notices our work. And so and he's still about it. And he's fantastic at it. He's, incredible. I would say that I still tend toward landscapes that are very legible and tend to be have edges to them. But I would say that this landscape was revelatory to me. I would say that I kind of shunned landscapes that were more like this. I didn't see, but I think again it's because of the architecture, because of the art, that it was like these really subtle synapses that were made. And in essence, I would say in some ways the distance between them. They're all doing what they do really well. The building is not trying to be landscape. It's not doing this, right? It's not topographic. It's not shapey, formy. That's a Martin Schwartz term, by the way. The landscape isn't trying to be architectural, and the art is doing its own thing. So I think that the great thing there is that again, it's more about a sensibility, not like a mimicry of one to the other. Cranbrook is a bit more of, it's about extending axes and extending the architecture out, right? Older architecture did that. And I would say that this landscape, again, was for me really a revelation in terms of the power that landscape has had to me, the things I've noticed about it, and the things I've learned to appreciate it, that I didn't see before coming here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.